My husband's brother lied I seduced him and was carrying his baby. My husband didn't even blink. He spat on me, his mom cursed me, and his sisters dragged me through the streets. I disappeared without a word. 2 years later he found me, and saw the child. His face went pale. He whispered, "Is that?" I shut the door. The pregnancy test trembled in my hands as 2 pink lines materialized like a promise of everything I'd ever wanted. After 18 months of trying, Kevin and I were finally going to be parents. I pressed the plastic stick against my chest, tears streaming down my face as I imagined his reaction. Maybe this would bridge the emotional distance that had grown between us since our wedding. Maybe a baby would make him look at me the way he used to. I tucked the test into my purse, planning to surprise him with dinner and the news tonight. But first, groceries. I needed to pick up ingredients for his favorite meal, lasagna with extra cheese, the way his mother Brittany used to make it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was constantly trying to compete with a woman who'd never accepted me into their tight-knit circle. Kevin had always been reserved, even during our courtship. His family meant everything to him. Sometimes I wondered if there was room for anyone else in that sacred space. His mother Brittany ruled the household with an iron fist wrapped in Sunday dinners and passive-aggressive comments about my cooking. His sisters, Nora and Audrey, followed her lead like devoted disciples, always finding subtle ways to remind me I was an outsider looking in. But it was Nick, Kevin's younger brother, who made my skin crawl. At 26, he still lived in his childhood bedroom, bouncing between odd jobs and recreational substances that left his eyes bloodshot and his judgment impaired. There was something predatory in the way he watched me during family gatherings, his gaze lingering too long when Kevin wasn't looking. 3 months ago, Nick had cornered me in the kitchen during Brittany's birthday celebration. The smell of alcohol clung to him as he leaned against the counter, blocking my escape route. "Your sister's pretty," he'd said, his words slightly slurred. "Real pretty. Think she'd be interested in settling down?" My younger sister Emma was only 22, fresh out of college and full of dreams that didn't include a deadbeat brother-in-law with substance issues. "She's focused on her career right now," I'd replied diplomatically, trying to sidestep around him. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist. "Come on, Heather. Put in a good word for me. Family should help family, right?" "I don't think you two would be compatible," I said firmly, pulling my arm free. The mark his fingers left faded quickly, but the memory lingered. Nick's expression darkened. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Coming in here with your college degree and your fancy job, acting like you're doing Kevin some kind of favor by marrying him. That's not. You'll regret this," he whispered, his voice dropping to something cold and threatening. "You'll regret looking down on me." I dismissed his words as the ramblings of someone whose brain had been fried by too many late nights and chemical enhancements. Kevin loved me. We were building a life together. Nick was just jealous, bitter about his own failures. How naive I'd been. The grocery store felt different that afternoon, every aisle gleaming with possibility. I found myself gravitating toward the baby section, running my fingers over tiny onesies and imagining Kevin's strong hands cradling our child. I picked up prenatal vitamins, my first official act as an expectant mother, and smiled at the elderly cashier who reminded me to take care of myself. The drive home was magical. I rehearsed different ways to break the news, settling on placing the test next to his dinner plate with a note. "Our family is growing." Simple. Perfect. Life-changing. But when I pulled into our driveway, something felt wrong. Too many cars lined the street. Kevin's truck sat crooked in the driveway as if he'd parked in a hurry. Through our front window I could see silhouettes moving around our living room, shapes that belonged to his entire family. My hands shook as I fumbled with the grocery bags, the pregnancy test burning like evidence in my purse. Maybe they were planning a surprise for someone's birthday. Maybe Brittany had decided to cook dinner here instead of her house. The front door swung open before I could reach for my keys. Kevin stood there, his face a mask of fury I'd never seen before. Behind him I could see Brittany, Nora and Audrey arranged like a tribunal in our living room. Nick sprawled on our couch, his expression smug and satisfied. "We need to talk," Kevin said, his voice flat and emotionless. I followed him inside, grocery bags still clutched in my numb fingers. The atmosphere was suffocating, charged with an electricity that made my skin prickle with warning. "Sit down," Brittany commanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I remained standing, clutching the bags like a shield. What's going on? Kevin held up a piece of paper, official-looking with medical letterhead and scientific terminology scattered across its surface. My eyes struggled to focus on the words, but certain phrases jumped out. DNA paternity test, conclusive results, biological father. Care to explain this? Kevin's voice cracked like a whip. I stared at the document, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. I don't understand. What is this? It's a DNA test, Nick said from the couch, his voice dripping with false concern. Kevin found it in your things. Apparently you've been keeping some pretty big secrets. The grocery bags slipped from my hands, cans rolling across our hardwood floor. That's impossible. I've never taken any DNA test. I don't know what this is. It says the baby you're carrying is Nick's, Audrey said, her voice sharp with accusation. It says you've been sleeping with your brother-in-law. The room tilted sideways. What baby? How did you? We found the pregnancy test in your purse, Nora said triumphantly. While you were out playing innocent at the grocery store. They'd gone through my personal belongings. They'd found my secret before I could share it with my own husband. But worse, somehow there was a document claiming Nick was the father of a child I'd only discovered hours ago. This is insane, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Kevin, you know me. You know I would never. His face contorted with disgust. I thought I knew you. Apparently I was wrong. Before I could react, before I could defend myself or demand an explanation, Kevin's saliva hit my face. The shock of it, the complete violation, left me frozen. My husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, had just spat on me like I was something disgusting he'd scraped off his shoe. You're revolting, he said, his voice filled with hatred I'd never imagined possible. Brittany's hand connected with my cheek before I could process what was happening. The slap echoed through our living room, followed immediately by Audrey's fingers tangling in my hair, yanking me toward the front door. Everyone needs to see what kind of woman you really are, Audrey snarled, dragging me outside. I screamed Kevin's name, begged him to listen, to think, to remember who I was. But he stood in our doorway watching as his sisters humiliated me in front of our neighbors, his face empty of any love that had ever existed between us. The lie had already taken root, growing like poison through everything I'd believed was real. The streetlights blurred through my tears as I stumbled away from what used to be my home. My face still stung from Brittany's slap, my scalp throbbed where Audrey had yanked my hair, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollowness spreading through my chest. Behind me I could hear car doors slamming, engines starting, the family retreating back to their fortress of self-righteousness. I didn't look back. Not once. My Honda Civic sat in the driveway like a faithful friend, the only thing in this nightmare that hadn't betrayed me. I slid behind the wheel, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. Where could I go? My parents had died in a car accident when I was 19. A fact that had drawn Kevin to me initially, his protective instincts activated by my orphan status. Now that protection felt like a cruel joke. Aunt Peyton lived 3 hours north, but she was 72 and battling her own health issues. The last thing she needed was her pregnant niece showing up on her doorstep with a scandal that would probably give her a heart attack. I couldn't do that to her. I couldn't burden the only family I had left with the wreckage of my life. I drove aimlessly through the suburbs, past houses glowing with warm light, families gathered around dinner tables, children safe in their parents' love. Everything I'd thought I had. Everything I'd lost in the span of 30 minutes. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat. Kevin's name flashed across the screen, then disappeared when I didn't answer. It buzzed again. And again. I finally grabbed it and powered it off completely, the sudden silence more terrifying than the incessant ringing. Claire. The name hit me like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. We'd been roommates in college, sisters by choice if not by blood. She'd moved to Portland 2 years ago for work, but we'd stayed close. If anyone would understand, if anyone would help without judgment, it would be Claire. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and used the payphone, an ancient relic that suddenly felt like salvation. My fingers trembled as I dialed her number from memory. Hello. Her voice sounded sleepy, confused. Claire, it's me. Heather. I'm sorry to call so late, but my voice cracked, the words catching in my throat like broken glass. Heather. What's wrong? You sound terrible. The concern in her voice, The immediate shift from confusion to protective mode broke something loose inside me. I sobbed into the grimy payphone receiver, gasping out fragments of the story between tears. The fake DNA test. Kevin's spit. The humiliation. The pregnancy that should have been a blessing but had become my destruction. "Get in your car right now," Claire said, her voice steel-wrapped in velvet. "Drive to Portland. Don't stop, don't think, just drive. I'll have coffee ready and a bed made up. We'll figure this out together." The 6-hour drive passed in a blur of highway lights and rest stops. I survived on gas station coffee and determination, my belly cramping occasionally, reminders of the tiny life growing inside me, innocent of the chaos surrounding its conception. Every mile that stretched between me and Kevin felt like another stitch in the wound, painful but necessary for healing. Claire met me at her apartment door wearing pajamas and a fierce expression that dared the world to hurt me further. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home. "We don't have to talk about it tonight," she whispered into my hair. "But tomorrow we're going to destroy whoever did this to you." Her guest room became my sanctuary. Claire worked as a graphic designer, mostly freelance, which meant flexible hours and the ability to check on me throughout the day. She bought prenatal vitamins without being asked, stocked the refrigerator with foods that wouldn't trigger my morning sickness, and never once questioned my version of events. "You could fight this," she said one evening as we sat on her couch, sharing a pint of mint chocolate chip ice cream. "Expose the fake DNA test. Make them pay for what they did." I pressed my hand against my growing belly, feeling the first flutter of movement that would later become kicks and hiccups and tiny feet pressing against my ribs. What if I can't prove it was fake? What if they've already convinced everyone? What if fighting just makes it worse? Claire studied my face in the lamplight. "What do you want to do?" "Disappear," I said without hesitation. "Completely. Let them live with their lie while I build something real." She nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do." The transformation began the next week. I applied for remote work positions, leveraging my marketing background to secure a position with a company that didn't care where I lived as long as I delivered results. Claire helped me set up a home office in her spare room, creating a workspace that felt professional and permanent. Months passed in a cocoon of quiet productivity. My belly grew round and firm, my body changing in ways that amazed and terrified me. I attended doctor's appointments alone, declined to learn the baby's gender, and carefully avoided any mention of the father on medical forms. This child would be mine alone. The November rain drummed against the hospital windows as labor pains gripped my body with increasing intensity. Claire held my hand through every contraction, coached me through every breath, and cried with me when Henry finally made his entrance into the world. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair that reminded me painfully of Kevin. His eyes, when they finally opened, were the same deep brown as his father's. My heart clenched with recognition and loss. "He looks like you," Claire lied kindly, but we both knew the truth. Henry looked exactly like Kevin. Every feature, every expression, every tiny mannerism as he grew would be a reminder of the man who'd chosen his family's lies over his wife's truth. But he was also mine, completely, utterly, unconditionally mine. The nights were the hardest. When Henry cried and I walked the floors of Claire's apartment, I sometimes imagined calling Kevin. Imagined his voice soft with wonder as I described our son's first smile, his tiny fist wrapped around my finger, the way he calmed instantly when I sang lullabies. But then I'd remember. The spit. The hatred in his eyes. The sisters who dragged me through the streets like I was trash to be discarded. The family that had chosen Nick's convenient lie over 2 years of marriage and love. I changed my phone number and blocked every possible way they could contact me. Social media accounts disappeared. Old email addresses were abandoned. Heather Morrison, Kevin's wife, ceased to exist. In her place, I became Heather Collins, single mother, survivor, woman who'd learned that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed. Henry and I built our quiet life in Portland, far from the poison of lies and false accusations. My absence became my statement. My silence became my strength. They'd wanted me gone. I gave them exactly what they wanted, and somehow that felt like winning. 2 years of peace shattered with a single phone call on a Tuesday morning. Henry was building towers with colorful blocks in our living room, his chubby fingers carefully stacking each piece while making soft vroom sounds. At 24 months he was becoming a little person with opinions and preferences, his father's stubborn streak already emerging when bedtime approached. Claire's voice carried an edge I hadn't heard since that first night I'd arrived on her doorstep. "Heather, we need to talk. Someone's been asking about you." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. In 2 years no one had come looking. I'd become a ghost, existing in the spaces between my old life and this new reality I'd carefully constructed. "Who?" The word came out sharper than intended. "Kevin. He contacted Sarah from our old college group. Asked if she'd heard from you, if she knew where you were. Sarah called me because she didn't know what to say." The living room seemed to tilt slightly. Henry looked up from his blocks, sensing the shift in energy with that uncanny ability children possess. His dark eyes, so much like his father's, studied my face with concern. "What did you tell Sarah?" "Nothing." "But Heather," he sounded desperate. "Sarah said he was crying on the phone." I set down my coffee with hands that had begun to shake. "I don't care if he was screaming. He made his choice 2 years ago." But Claire's silence stretched too long and I knew there was more. "What aren't you telling me?" "Sarah mentioned something else. Kevin's brother, Nick, he's been in the hospital. Something about pneumonia that turned serious. She heard it through the grapevine." The mention of Nick's name still made my stomach clench, but I felt no sympathy for his illness. Good. Maybe karma finally caught up with him. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that in a sterile hospital room 3 states away, Nick was drowning in more than just fluid in his lungs. The infection had triggered a high fever that broke down the walls he'd built around his conscience. And in his delirium, the truth began pouring out like poison from an infected wound. Kevin had been maintaining a vigil at Nick's bedside, their mother rotating shifts with their sisters. The family that had rallied so quickly to destroy me now gathered to save the one who'd orchestrated it all. But guilt, it turned out, was a more persistent infection than pneumonia. "I did it," Nick had whispered through the oxygen mask, his voice barely audible above the machines monitoring his failing body. "I made it all up." Kevin initially thought it was fever talk, meaningless rambling from a brain struggling with infection and medication. But Nick kept repeating it, becoming more agitated when no one seemed to understand. "The DNA test. I faked it. Heather never. She never did anything. I wanted to hurt her because she wouldn't help me with her sister. I wanted to destroy her." The confession came in fragments over several delirious hours, each piece falling into place like a jigsaw puzzle revealing a picture too horrible to comprehend. Nick described how he'd found the pregnancy test in my purse when I'd left it unattended during a family dinner. How he'd researched online laboratories and created a convincing fake document using medical terminology and official-looking letterheads. How he'd planted it where Kevin would find it while I was out buying groceries for the surprise dinner that never happened. Kevin's world imploded in that hospital room. The brother he'd defended, the family member whose word he'd taken over his wife's, had systematically destroyed the only good thing in Kevin's life. And he'd helped. He'd been the weapon Nick used to tear apart my world. The attack happened right there in the ICU. Kevin's hands found Nick's throat before rational thought could intervene, alarms screaming as medical staff rushed to separate them. Security was called. Kevin was banned from the hospital for 24 hours while Nick's condition stabilized. But the damage to their family had just begun. Kevin stormed into his mother's house like a hurricane, demanding answers, screaming questions that had no good responses. Had they known? Had they suspected? How could they have been so quick to believe Nick's lies? Brittany's breakdown was spectacular and ugly. She'd orchestrated my public humiliation, led the charge to drag me through the streets like a scarlet woman. The realization that she'd destroyed an innocent woman, her own daughter-in-law, sent her into hysterics that required medical intervention. Nora and Audrey faced their own reckonings. The sisters who'd been so eager to play judge and jury found themselves confronting the reality that they'd participated in ruining the life of someone who'd done nothing wrong. The guilt consumed them in different ways. Nora developing panic attacks that left her unable to sleep, Audrey throwing herself into volunteer work at women's shelters as if she could somehow balance the scales of karma. Kevin's search for me began that same week. He started with the obvious places. Hospitals where I might have given birth, apartment complexes near where we'd lived, old coworkers who might have stayed in touch. He hired a private investigator who came up empty-handed. I'd vanished more completely than any of them had imagined possible. Desperation drove him to create fake social media profiles, joining groups for new mothers, scanning photos for a glimpse of my face. He contacted every mutual friend we'd ever had, leaving voicemails that grew more frantic with each passing day. "If you hear from Heather, please tell her I know the truth now. Please tell her I'm sorry. Please tell her I'll do anything to make this right." But I'd severed those connections so thoroughly that his messages fell into voids. The private investigator's report was devastating in its completeness. No credit cards, no lease agreements, no employment records, no digital footprints. Heather Morrison had effectively ceased to exist. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Claire had been watching my emotional deterioration as Kevin's search intensified. The stress was affecting my work, my sleep, my ability to be fully present for Henry. She made a decision that would change everything, motivated by love and concern for my well-being. When Kevin's investigator contacted her directly, she broke. Not completely, she didn't reveal my location or current identity. But she confirmed that I was alive, that I was safe, and that I had indeed been pregnant when I disappeared. "She had the baby," Claire told the investigator, her voice heavy with the weight of betrayal she was committing against my trust. "And you need to know, the child looks exactly like Kevin. Nothing like Nick. Nothing at all." That single thread was all Kevin needed. He followed it back to Claire, staking out her apartment building, tracking her movements, waiting for the moment when desperation would overcome my careful security measures. The hunt had begun and my 2 years of peace were about to end. The knock came at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening, just as Henry and I were finishing our ritual of watering the small herb garden we'd planted together in Claire's backyard. The sound echoed through the apartment with a finality that made my blood freeze. Not the casual tap-tap of a neighbor or the rhythmic pattern of a delivery driver. This was deliberate, measured, weighted with intention. Henry looked up from the tiny watering can he'd been using to drench the basil plants, his little face bright with the simple joy of helping. "Door, Mama." I knew. Without looking through the peephole, without checking the security monitor Claire had installed after my arrival, I knew exactly who stood on the other side of that wooden barrier. My body recognized the sound the way trauma survivors recognize their triggers. Instantly, viscerally, completely. My hands shook as I approached the door, Henry trailing behind me with his watering can still clutched in his fists. Through the peephole, Kevin's face appeared distorted by the fisheye lens, but unmistakably him. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 2 years. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken into dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and endless guilt. The strong jawline I'd once loved to trace with my fingertips now looked sharp enough to cut glass. I opened the door just wide enough to see him clearly, keeping the chain lock engaged. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hallway, but nothing could hide the devastation written across his features. "Heather." My name fell from his lips like a prayer, broken and desperate. Behind me, Henry had gone silent in that way children do when they sense adult tension. I could feel his presence at my hip, his small body warm against my leg as he peered around me with curious eyes. Kevin's gaze dropped to Henry and I watched his face transform. The recognition was immediate and devastating. Henry's dark hair caught the hallway light the same way Kevin's did. The shape of his nose, the set of his shoulders, even at 2 years old, it was like looking at Kevin as a toddler. "Is that?" Kevin's voice cracked, the question hanging in the air between us like smoke. I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped back and closed the door with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire building. But Kevin didn't leave. I could see his shadow beneath the door, could hear him breathing on the other side of the wood. For 20 minutes, he stood there in absolute silence while Henry and I finished dinner, while I gave Henry his bath, while I read him his bedtime story. Only when the hallway lights switched to their dimmer evening setting did I hear his footsteps finally retreating. He returned the next evening. And the evening after that. On the 4th day I found a letter slipped under the door. My name was written across the envelope in Kevin's careful handwriting, the same script that had once adorned love notes hidden in my lunch bag. I threw it away without opening it. More letters followed. Gift boxes appeared outside the door, children's toys that remained unopened, flowers that wilted in their wrapping paper, photos of our wedding day that made my chest ache with phantom pain. I donated the toys to charity and threw everything else in the dumpster behind Claire's building. The apologies came through the door itself, Kevin's voice muffled but audible as he spoke to the wood as if it were my face. I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. Please, Heather. Just let me explain. Henry began asking questions. Why sad man talk door, mama? I told him the man was confused that he had the wrong apartment. But children see truth in ways adults can't, and Henry's eyes held knowledge beyond his years when he looked at that door. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night when I'd worked late on a particularly demanding project. Claire was out of town visiting her parents and the apartment felt too quiet, too vulnerable. I'd just gotten Henry settled in his crib when I heard movement in the hallway. Kevin wasn't knocking this time. He was sitting against my door, his back pressed to the wood, and he was crying. Not the careful, controlled tears of a man trying to maintain dignity, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose world had completely collapsed. I believed them, he whispered to the door, his voice barely audible through the wood. God help me, I believed them because it was easier than admitting I might be wrong. It was easier than standing up to my family. It was easier than choosing you over them. I pressed my own back against the door, separated from him by 3 inches of wood and 2 years of devastation. I threw away everything good in my life because I was a coward. Because I let them convince me that their version of events made more sense than trusting the woman I married. The woman I promised to protect. His voice broke completely then, and I could hear him struggling to breathe through his tears. I see your face every night when I close my eyes. I see the way you looked at me when I spit on you. I see the confusion, the betrayal, the way your whole world fell apart in that moment. And I know I did that. I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too weak to fight for you. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, my knees drawn up to my chest, listening to the man I'd once loved pour his heart out to a piece of wood. That little boy in there, he's mine, isn't he? He has my eyes. My mother's chin. The way he holds his head when he's curious, I used to do that as a child. He's my son, and I'll never get to know him because I chose to believe a lie instead of trusting my wife. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and cold. You're right. You'll never know him. Because I'm not the same woman who loved you, Kevin. That woman died the night you chose your family's lies over 2 years of marriage. And Henry isn't your son to claim just because you feel guilty now. The silence that followed stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, I heard him stand, heard his hand touch the door one last time. I know, he whispered. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know, I never stopped loving you. Even when I thought you'd betrayed me, part of me knew it didn't make sense. And I'll spend the rest of my life regretting that I didn't listen to that part. His footsteps faded down the hallway, but this time I knew he'd be back. The door between us had become a symbol of protection, of boundaries, of the life I'd built without him. And I had no intention of opening it. Kevin's individual visits had prepared me for his persistence, but I wasn't ready for the delegation that arrived 3 weeks later. Through the peephole, I watched them gather in the hallway like mourners at a wake. Brittany clutching a manila envelope to her chest, Nora fidgeting with rosary beads, Audrey holding what appeared to be a professionally wrapped gift box. The knock came in a pattern I didn't recognize, hesitant and apologetic. When I didn't respond, I heard Brittany's voice, thinner than I remembered, aged by guilt and sleepless nights. Heather, please. We know you're in there. You just want to talk. We need to make this right. Henry was napping in his room, and I was grateful for the silence that meant he wouldn't witness this moment. I stood frozen behind the door, watching through the peephole as Kevin's family, the people who had orchestrated my public destruction, waited for forgiveness I had no intention of granting. We brought letters, Nora added, her voice barely above a whisper. Explanations. We know what we did was unforgivable, but please. I walked away from the door without responding. Let them stand there. Let them feel the weight of closed doors and silence. Let them understand what it felt like to be shut out, unwanted, dismissed. They waited for an hour before finally leaving their offerings and departing. When Claire returned from her business trip that evening, she found me sitting on the couch, surrounded by unopened envelopes and gift boxes, staring at them like they might explode. They came here, I said simply. Claire's expression hardened. She'd been fielding increasingly desperate calls from Kevin's family members, each one begging for her intervention, her help in reaching me. She'd become my inadvertent gatekeeper, a role that was wearing on her patience. What do you want me to do with these? She asked, gesturing at the pile of attempted reconciliation. Send them back. But first I want you to deliver a message. Claire waited, her notebook already in hand. Tell them, you shamed me in public. You will heal in silence. The message was delivered, but it didn't stop them. Brittany's letters began arriving daily, each one more desperate than the last. They were handwritten on her personal stationery, the same elegant script she'd used to address our wedding invitations. The irony wasn't lost on me. I never opened them, but Claire did, reporting back on their contents with a mixture of fascination and disgust. She's taking full responsibility, Claire told me one evening. Says she let her protective instincts for Kevin override her judgment. That she should have questioned Nick's story more carefully. And she wants to know about her grandchild. Asks if Henry has any medical issues she should know about, if he needs anything, if you're financially stable. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Now she wants to be a grandmother. After calling me a whore in front of the entire neighborhood. Nora's approach was different. She'd apparently entered therapy specifically to address her role in my public humiliation, and her therapist had suggested she attempt to make amends as part of her healing process. She began showing up at places I frequented: the grocery store, the pediatrician's office, the park where Henry played. She never approached directly, but she was always there, hovering at the edges of my life like a guilty ghost. Claire finally confronted her in the cereal aisle of our local supermarket. "Stop stalking my friend," Claire had said, loud enough for other shoppers to hear. "Your guilt is not her responsibility to fix." Nora's face had crumpled, but she'd nodded and left the store immediately. Audrey chose the most public route for her contrition. Her social media apology was shared thousands of times. A carefully crafted essay about the dangers of jumping to conclusions, the importance of supporting women in crisis, and the lasting damage caused by public shaming. She tagged domestic violence organizations and women's shelters, turning her guilt into activism. The post found its way to me through old college friends who forwarded it with messages of support and shock. Reading Audrey's words, her admission that she'd participated in destroying an innocent woman's life, felt surreal. She was performing her guilt for an audience, making her redemption as public as my humiliation had been. During this circus of atonement, I made a decision that would protect Henry and me permanently. Aunt Peyton, despite her age and health issues, proved to be a fierce advocate when I explained the situation. She connected me with a family lawyer who specialized in protecting women from abusive situations. "No father listed on the birth certificate means no legal rights," the lawyer explained during our consultation. "As far as the law is concerned, this child has one parent. You maintain that position from birth, which strengthens your case significantly." We created what the lawyer called a legal firewall, documentation that would prevent any future custody claims, visitation demands, or interference in Henry's life. The process was thorough and emotionally draining, requiring me to provide detailed accounts of the false accusations, the public humiliation, and the complete abandonment I'd experienced. But there was one person who hadn't yet received my direct attention. Nick, the architect of this destruction, was still recovering from his illness, still hiding behind his family's attempts at reconciliation. I wrote him exactly one letter. One sentence on plain white paper. "You destroyed a woman and created a mother. That child will never know your name." I never heard back. The pressure from Kevin's family eventually wore him down to the point of desperation. He began leaving increasingly frantic voicemails for Claire, begging for just one conversation, one chance to see his son, one opportunity to prove he'd changed. Against my better judgment and influenced by Claire's growing exhaustion with the situation, I finally agreed to meet him. Not at my apartment, not on my territory, but at a neutral location. A family restaurant with bright lights and plenty of witnesses. I brought Henry, curious to see Kevin's reaction to the child he'd rejected, the son he'd never held. Kevin arrived early and was already seated when Henry and I walked in. I watched his face as we approached the table, saw the exact moment recognition hit him like a physical blow. Henry, now walking confidently and chattering constantly, was an unmistakable miniature version of his father. "Hi," Henry said to Kevin with the fearless friendliness of a toddler, climbing into the booster seat across from this stranger who shared his eyes. Kevin stared at his son, our son, with an expression of wonder and devastation that was painful to witness. Henry smiled back, completely unaware of the seismic emotional shifts happening around him. I don't deserve him, do I? Kevin whispered, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. I said nothing. Because he was right. And some truths don't require acknowledgement to remain absolute. That single meeting at the restaurant changed everything and nothing all at once. Kevin's whispered acknowledgement, I don't deserve him, do I? Hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire. Henry, oblivious to the weight of the moment, had colored on his kids' menu and asked Kevin if he liked dinosaurs. The normalcy of childhood innocence against the backdrop of adult devastation created a surreal tableau that would replay in my mind for months. I established rules after that meeting. Rigid, non-negotiable boundaries that would govern any future contact. Kevin could see Henry once annually on Henry's birthday for exactly 2 hours, with Claire present as a neutral supervisor. No overnight visits. No family gatherings. No integration into the Morrison family dynamic that had destroyed us both. The first supervised visit happened when Henry turned 3. Kevin arrived with a carefully wrapped gift, a wooden train set that must have cost him a week's salary. He sat on Claire's living room floor, showing Henry how to connect the tracks while I watched from the kitchen doorway, my arms crossed like armor across my chest. What's your name? Henry had asked with typical toddler directness. I'm Kevin, he'd answered, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to contain. Mr. Kevin, Henry decided, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. Do you have kids, Mr. Kevin? The question hit Kevin like a physical blow. I watched him struggle with the answer, his hands stilling on the wooden train cars. No, he finally said. No, I don't have kids. It was the truth in the most devastating way possible. Biologically, Henry was his son. Legally, emotionally, relationally, Henry belonged entirely to me. Kevin had forfeited any claim to fatherhood the night he chose his family's lies over his wife's truth. That pattern continued year after year. Kevin became Mr. Kevin, the nice man who brought expensive toys and looked sad when Henry hugged him goodbye. Henry never asked why Mr. Kevin came only once a year, never questioned why this man shared his eyes and smile. Children accept the reality they're given, and Henry's reality was me, Claire, and the life we'd built together. But Kevin's family underwent their own transformations, though I observed them from a distance like a scientist studying specimens under glass. Brittany's guilt had driven her to volunteer work at a women's shelter 2 hours away from her hometown, far enough that she wouldn't encounter anyone who knew our story. Claire heard through mutual connections that Brittany threw herself into the work with the desperation of someone seeking absolution through service. She specifically works with women who've been falsely accused or publicly shamed, Claire reported after running into a college friend who volunteered at the same shelter. Apparently, she's become quite the advocate. Helps them navigate legal systems, find safe housing, rebuild their lives. I felt no satisfaction in this knowledge, no sense that justice had been served. Brittany's transformation felt more like self-preservation than true redemption. A way to live with herself rather than genuine understanding of the damage she'd caused. Nora had channeled her guilt into journalism, writing articles for local magazines about domestic justice issues and the danger of rushing to judgment in family disputes. Her pieces were well-researched and thoughtfully written, though I detected the underlying current of personal experience that drove her passion for the subject. She'd become an expert on false accusations within families, the psychology of belief, and the lasting trauma of public humiliation. Audrey's path surprised me most. She'd left her corporate job to work with special needs children, dedicating herself to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Her social media presence had evolved from personal updates to advocacy posts about children's rights and anti-bullying initiatives. The woman who dragged me through the streets had become someone who fought to ensure other children never experienced public shame. I didn't forgive any of them, but I recognized the change. Their guilt had transformed them into people who might actually prevent another woman from experiencing what I'd endured. It was a strange form of justice. My destruction had created advocates who might save others from similar fates. Meanwhile, Claire and I had discovered our own purpose in the wreckage. We'd started small, just conversations with women who'd reached out after Audrey's viral apology post. They found us through mutual friends, through support networks, through the underground railroad of women who'd survived false accusations and public shaming. Our support group met monthly in Claire's living room, then moved to a community center as our numbers grew. We called ourselves the Silent Strength, not because we stayed quiet, but because we'd learned that sometimes the most powerful response to destruction was to rebuild louder than we'd been broken. "We don't scream," became our unofficial motto. "We don't fight. We walk away and rebuild." I shared my story carefully, focusing on the recovery rather than the trauma. How I'd created legal protections for Henry. How I'd established financial independence. How I'd built a life that couldn't be destroyed by other people's lies because it wasn't dependent on their validation. Other women shared their experiences. Wives accused of affairs they'd never had, mothers falsely reported for child abuse by vindictive ex-partners, professionals whose reputations had been destroyed by malicious gossip. We taught each other practical skills: legal documentation, financial protection, digital security, emotional boundaries. But perhaps the most powerful part of our meetings was the simple act of being believed. In a room full of women who'd experienced false accusations, no one questioned anyone's truth. No one demanded proof or evidence. We simply listened, believed, and helped each other heal. Nick remained the one loose thread in this tapestry of transformation. His physical health had recovered, but his isolation was complete and self-imposed. He'd lost his job when his role in my destruction became public knowledge. Old friends avoided him. Even his family maintained distance, their love for him tainted by the understanding of what he'd cost them all. I heard through Aunt Peyton's gossip network that he'd moved to a different state, working odd jobs and living alone in a studio apartment. His power, his ability to manipulate and destroy, had evaporated along with his credibility. He existed but didn't live, survived but didn't thrive. I never sent him another letter, never acknowledged his existence beyond that single sentence I'd written years earlier. His punishment wasn't my responsibility to enforce. It was simply the natural consequence of his choices, the isolation that comes from being the kind of person who destroys innocent lives for petty revenge. Sometimes, late at night when Henry was sleeping and the apartment was quiet, I reflected on the nature of revenge. I'd wanted to scream my truth, to fight back, to force them all to acknowledge what they'd done to me. Instead, I'd vanished. That silence had become my sword, cutting deeper and lasting longer than any confrontation could have achieved. My absence had destroyed them more effectively than my presence ever could have. They had to live with their choices, with their guilt, with the knowledge that they'd thrown away something precious and irreplaceable. I got to live with my son, my peace, and the unshakable knowledge that I'd survived their worst and built something beautiful from the wreckage. Revenge, I'd learned, wasn't what you did to people who hurt you. It was what you refused to let them take from you again. If this story of silent revenge had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. My heart broke when Heather told Kevin, "Henry isn't yours to claim just because you feel sorry now." That line was everything. What moment hit you the hardest? Drop your favorite scene in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe and hit that bell because these stories of women who rebuild louder than they were broken will give you chills.